I've just been introduced. And it occurred to me relatively recently that we get a lot of people involved in the party because they're sympathetic to, some of the views that we have on different issues, and generally sympathetic to the idea of maybe the government shouldn't be as involved in their lives. But they aren't necessarily familiar with kind of the underlying philosophy or thinking that kind of propels all of that forward, that motivates those of us, especially those of us who have been involved in a party for a while. And we also tend to use a lot of jargon that somebody who's not necessarily in the libertarian movement would recognize. Like if someone talks about the NAP, or the non-aggression principle, especially if they call it the NAP or NAP. Unless you're already involved in libertarianism and already having conversations with people, you probably have no idea what they're talking about when they say that. So I figured it would be good to get just a very basic, here's what this is, here's kind of the general history of the idea, here's some implications of it, so that people kind of know what's being talked about when someone says the non-aggression principle. So, the non-aggression principle is basically, it's a foundational moral principle in libertarian thought. Not every single libertarian agrees with the non-aggression principle. There are libertarians that would identify as something like a consequentialist or something like that, where they don't necessarily accept this as the correct way of analyzing or implementing libertarianism. But most people in the libertarian movement either agree with the non-aggression principle, or at least they think it's roughly correct. It's the general thrust of what we're doing. I do want to preemptively say I am not in any way a philosopher or an economist. So if I do it dumb, I apologize. If anyone here is deeply familiar with this stuff and I commit any errors, I apologize. I'm just a guy who just reads about this stuff. So I will primarily be focusing on specifically how the non-aggression principle is formulated by a couple of key thinkers in the libertarian movement, which is Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard. One can argue forever about whether Ayn Rand or Murray Rothbard or someone else was the first person to coin the non-aggression principle. That's not the reason I'm focusing on those two. I'm focusing on those two specifically because they're both very well-known thinkers within the libertarian community. They're both people who have explicitly formulated a version of the non-aggression principle that's well-known with the libertarian community, so they're a good starting point for understanding what's being talked about. So, the history of the non-aggression principle, as far as how far back it goes, it really depends on how fast and loose you want to play with it. A really, really broad interpretation of the non-aggression principle could be just the golden rule, just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think that's stretching it out a little too much. That's really not as clear or specific as the non-aggression principle actually is. But as you move forward in history and as you move towards the Enlightenment, such as the 17th and 18th century, you start getting people like John Locke, and in particular Immanuel Kant, you start getting ideas that sound a lot closer to what we would mean by the non-aggression principle. Kant's categorical imperative, for example, where an idea has to be sort of logically consistent and be applicable to every human being to be morally true. Rothbard's argument for the non-aggression principle, which I'll be going over here shortly, is pretty similar to that, so you kind of see a precursor in Kant. But the first real formulations of the non-aggression principle that were referred to as the non-aggression principle and got real specific and into the nitty-gritty were the formulations of people like Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard in the early 20th century. I do have their formulations. I'm just going to quote them directly before I dive into it. Ayn Rand stated, "The precondition of a civilized society is the barring of physical force from social relationships. In a civilized society, force may only be used in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use." Murray Rothbard's formulation, which is fairly similar, is, "No one may threaten or commit violence or aggress against another man's person or property. Violence may be employed only against the man who commits such violence. That is, only defensively against the aggressive violence of another. In short, no violence may be employed against a non-aggressor. Here is the fundamental rule from which can be deduced the entire corpus of libertarian theory." So, those are quick quotes, but they don't really kind of flesh it out, so I'm going to try to do that here a little bit. The foundation of the non-aggression principle is the concept of property, which is the idea that there are things in the world that somebody has rightful control over and other people don't have rightful control over it. For example, Becca presumably owns her purse. That is her property, which means she has the right to dispose of it as she sees fit, to touch it, grab it, move it around, swing it, fill it with stuff, whatever, purse things. But I, without her permission, don't have the right to just take her purse or run away with it or slide it on fire or whatever I might think of.
Or go through it.
Right. So typically, the argument for the non-aggression principle starts with the idea that you own yourself. So that would include your body, of course. Your physical body is your property. There's really not a reasonable case to be made that your physical body can be someone else's property or someone else's thing to rightfully dispose of at their will. Your mind and the contents of it are obviously your property. Very similarly to your body, it really doesn't make any rational sense to say that anyone else has a right to your mind or to manipulate it or control it or own it, if that's even possible. Like, what would that even consist of? And then your will, which is your desire to do things in the world, is obviously your property as well. Your ability to choose what to do with your mind and body. And then from there, that still leaves open the question of, well, what about all the stuff that isn't a human body or a human mind or a human will, like purses and cars and roads and trees and fruit and stuff. Typically, there are different arguments about how property should be determined, but usually what you'll see among libertarians is a combination of two principles. The first is the homestead principle, which is that if there's something that's out in nature that nobody has touched or manipulated in such a way, and you, through your labor, transform it into something useful, it is now your property. For example, if there was an unused plot of land and you cut down the trees in it and you built a house, according to the homestead principle, you've taken something that was in the commons and have transformed it into your property by imbuing it with your will, essentially. The other common way one acquires property, according to libertarian theory, is trade in contract, which is maybe you didn't build a house, but you have something else of value that you were willing to trade for the house, or someone likes you, so they're going to gift you the house, or something like that. Basically, acquiring property with the consent of the property owner to exchange ownership with somebody else.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Now, you said something that really a lot of libertarians may not be aware of, but my theory, if you pay tax on it, you don't own it. Sorry.
Yep.
And so if it's land and you're paying tax on it, you don't own it.
So there's a distinction there between the moral principle of ownership and legal ownership. You do own it morally.
Right.
But from a legal standpoint, you don't. You're basically renting it from the government. But those are distinct, and it's important because when we talk about things like rights, for example, if the government takes away your right, that doesn't mean you don't have that right. Morally, you have the right to your life, to your liberty, and your property. The fact that the government is infringing on that right doesn't take that away. But legally, you could argue you don't have that right because the government can show up and do that. So yeah, there is a sense in which property tax, for example, is paying rent on your own property, and therefore you don't own it. But morally speaking, which is kind of what we're still talking about here, you do own it because it's your rightful property of the government, which we're going to get into.
Well, you just threw the land in there so that it made me think of, hey, this is a principle that I've been trying to get around. That's why I don't own land, because there's certain ways to own land without the government charging taxes.
Well, the property system we have now isn't really built on libertarian principles, and that's where things get real complicated. So I'm starting with just these are the basic principles, not just.
And there is a difference between property and land, according to Henry George, anyway.
Well, I'm not arguing George's property. So I am arguing from a standpoint of land can in fact be property, and that you don't owe a tax for existing on land. Though I am familiar with that viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, yeah, either the homestead principle, which is you transform. I use land as an example. It doesn't have to be land. A really good example is if there's just a tree out in the woods and you pull a piece of fruit from it, that's now your property. It wasn't your property before you touched it. It wasn't anybody's property. It's just a fruit on a tree in the middle of the woods. But now that you've grabbed it and removed it from the tree, you have transformed it and thus homesteaded it, and it has become your property. So the other foundational idea, besides property ownership and how it relates to your body, mind, will, and things out in the world, is the concept of aggression, which is basically when you use or threaten to use physical force against another person or their property. The non-aggression principle, as you might have guessed by the name, is against that. It's for non-aggression, which means you do not have the right to initiate, and this is a key word, initiate force against someone else's person or property. But you do have the right to retaliate or defend yourself against such an initiation with defensive or protective force. So the common sense example would be if someone punches you in the face, you're in no way obligated to just sit there and take it. You can punch them back or shove them away or do something that if they hadn't punched you in the face would absolutely be aggression. But given that they have punched you in the face, is self-defense. So it's essentially the argument that you have the right to defend yourself, but you do not have the right to put others in the position where they have to defend themselves. So I've given you an outline of what it is, but I haven't told you why it's true. I mean, I just laid out a bunch of ideas, that this could be a moral principle, but maybe it's wrong. Maybe there are times you should initiate force. Maybe my idea of property is wrong. There's any number of ways. I haven't given a defense of any of this yet. So I did want to kind of very briefly go over very broadly a couple of arguments for why the non-aggression principle might be correct, as in it might be an objectively true moral principle, which would mean that you can assess things morally based on it and declare things moral or immoral that are independent of someone's subjective opinion. The first I'm going to give is kind of a very brief summation of Ayn Rand's argument for the non-aggression principle. Ayn Rand, for those of you familiar with her, are probably well aware of this, was a big fan of reason. She saw human reason as the primary means by which human beings interacted with the world in order to live. The application of reason is how you understand the world, it's how you produce things, it's how you get things done. She saw reason as inherently manifesting in a cooperative fashion, meaning if I have a conversation with Arthur and he and I are talking, that's a rational process. Reason is part of the equation, hypothetically. But if I were to pull a gun on Arthur, that takes reason out of it. I'm basically attempting to remove from Arthur his ability to reason through the situation and force him to do something he otherwise would not want to do. So from Rand's perspective, the reason that it is wrong to initiate force, probably not the only reason she thought that, but the main reason she thought that is because it interfered with the rational process of an individual to interact with the world with the kind of consequences you would expect. A society built on the idea that it's okay to do that is a society that's regularly inhibiting people's ability to engage in reason, which is going to mean less productivity, less freedom, less all the things most of us like. She also believed that there was a harmony of interest among rational actors, meaning that if let's say me and someone else both go for a job and I don't get the job, someone might argue, well, isn't it in my self-interest to injure the guy who got the job so that they then have to call me and give me the job? And her response to that would be that it only in the most crude sense would be in my self-interest, because in terms of my long-term rational self-interest, it's better for me to live in a society that respects people's right to life, liberty, and property, but I don't get a job, than it is for me to live in a society where I get that job, but we don't respect people's right to life, liberty, and property. So the idea is that you might sometimes lose out in the short term, but the long-term payoff of living in a society where those rights are respected is much greater than any sort of short-term benefit you might get from stealing from somebody or attacking them or whatever. Murray Rothbard, for those of you not familiar, definitely read Rothbard, made an argument that's kind of similar to Kant's categorical imperative. He argued that if we start with the assumption that for a moral principle to be universal, it has to be something that can be followed conceivably by every human being consistently, then he argued the only moral principle that really follows that is the non-aggression principle. A principle where you can initiate force doesn't pass a consistency check, essentially, because it requires that some people be allowed to do things to other people that they don't want to do, so you end up with sort of a contradiction there. Like, I don't know, Arthur's next to me, so I'm using, if I want to punch Arthur in the face, but he doesn't want to be punched in the face. Which one of us is right? Well, I mean, Arthur's right. But the point is, there's not a consistent moral principle that's guiding the interaction. But if he and I are both, I'm formulating this badly, you should read Rothbard. But his argument is a little more complicated than Rand's. But essentially the idea is that if you're trying to come up with a moral principle that everybody can conceivably follow without any sort of contradiction between what one person wants and what another person wants, the non-aggression principle is what fits the bill. You're allowed to defend yourself, you can't initiate force. Now those are very, very brief summaries of what are much more complicated arguments. So if you're interested in sort of the philosophical foundations, I would recommend reading The Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard, as well as Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal by Ayn Rand. Those both would give a much more thorough account of the respective authors' ideas behind the non-aggression principle and how they arrive at that conclusion. So there are some implications of the non-aggression principle that if you're already involved in the libertarian movement, you probably already agree with. And if you're not, you probably think are strange things that only crazy people say. One of those would be taxation is theft. The reason for that is that if you rightfully own your property, then including currency, wealth, whatever it may be, then it is aggression for someone to take that property from you without your consent. The non-aggression principle doesn't make exceptions based on whether somebody works for the government or whether something was democratically voted for. It's arguing that this is a moral principle that's true irrespective of public opinion or anything else. As a result, you'll often hear libertarians say the refrain, taxation is theft, and that's what they mean by that. They mean when the government shows up and takes part of your paycheck, or says you have to pay them money to keep your house, or whatever else it may be, they are infringing on your right to property because you don't consent to that interaction. So they're initiating aggression. And to kind of further outline that, because a lot of people do push a little bit back on this, because they'll say, well, they don't aggress against you, they just write you a letter. Well, don't reply to the letter, and then don't pay what you owe them. And then when they show up to take your stuff, try to keep your stuff. You will find very quickly that if you keep pushing the issue, it does eventually escalate to them using violence. And the letter they send out ahead of time is a threat of violence, even if it doesn't say that in bold letters on the front. So, another implication is another refrain. Yeah?
There's a guy named Corey DeAngelis. He works for both Reason and Cato, I think. And he has a master's degree from UTSA and
Jasmine, Omar?
and a PhD from University of Arkansas. He studies a lot of school choice. And I saw something he said on Twitter recently. He said that there were times in the 1800s when the Massachusetts militia was called out to force parents to bring their kids to school.
I can believe that. I can't confirm that, but I can't believe it.
But that's the issue got pushed, and push came to shove, people would come.
Yeah, ultimately at the end of the day, if you don't do what the government wants you to do, and you stand by that, they will eventually escalate the issue to violence. That's honestly, among political theorists, even among non-libertarian political theorists, this is actually not a controversial point. Max Weber's famous formulation of what a state is the organization that has the legitimate use of physical force over a specific geographical area. It's only among sort of people that are both not libertarian and not really political theorists that they get confused when you say there's violence involved in, say, taxation. Of government laws and things like that.
So, better word is extortion.
It is. Taxation is theft is catchier, but taxation is extortion.
Probably
is
more accurate.
A little more.
And people that get more aggressive when they're born, taxation is slavery on the grounds that you're having to give up part of your labor against your will. What's up?
And when I talk about fiscal policy in class, I always tell the class that fiscal policy is when you don't pay your taxes and the government gets physical with you.
Nice.
Sorry, I'll show it.
Yeah. So another common refrain that's kind of implied by the non-aggression principle that you'll hear from libertarians is no victim, no crime. The idea here being that for there to be aggression, which is what we've determined through the non-aggression principle is what is immoral. That's what an immoral act is. It's aggressive. There has to be a victim. You have to aggress against somebody. You can't aggress against society or something like that. There has to be a concrete person or group of persons that is the victim of your act for it to be aggressive. I can't just punch in the air. Like, I have to punch somebody, right? Like, there has to be a
You
victim.
have to punch Arthur.
I do. So, the implication of the non-aggression principle is that there has to be a victim. So crimes that are so-called victimless crimes, like the use of drugs or prostitution or things like that, where nobody has aggressed against anybody. They're purely consensual acts. And in the case of drug use, it's not even a consensual act because it's not even involving more than one person. It's just you and your own body. The libertarian argument would be that those are not properly crimes and therefore there should be no laws against them, and it is immoral to use force against somebody for doing those things. So if you hear the refrain, no victim, no crime, that's what that is referring to. It's referring to the fact that for something to be a crime, somebody has to be the victim, and it has to be a concrete victim. It can't be some vague, philosophic victim like society to justify essentially pretending there's a victim when you can't point to a victim.
You looked at me wrong. Oh, I'm a victim.
Yeah, you are a victim. So there are some areas of active debate within the libertarian community, even among people that believe in the non-aggression principle. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some ideas to give you some idea of where the flexibility is and where it's not necessarily set in stone. One area of active debate is fraud. So if I lie to somebody, is that aggression? Some will argue no, on the grounds that I'm not threatening somebody with violence. They still have full control of their will. They can choose to not interact with me. They can choose to not trust me. Therefore, it's not aggression. The alternative argument would be, and this is kind of the Randian argument, which would be if the point of human interaction is to make use of reason to better ourselves, lying to somebody, just like threatening them with physical force, is attempting to short-circuit their reason in order to give you what you want at their expense. So that would be the argument that fraud should be considered a form of aggression. I'm not going to offer answers to any of these, by the way. I'm just offering, this is the debate. If you want my personal opinion, you can ask me in private.
Well,
Yes.
if it's words, are words aggressive? We have a chance to channel outwards or be affected by them or not. So realistically, unless it's physical, I don't see where it's aggressive.
That would be one argument. Like, I'm not presenting these as, I'm not presenting any of these as I have a specific side that I think is correct, even though in all of them I do. I'm just trying to offer a general overview. So that is the argument for why it's not aggression.
Right.
Another one is, and this is everyone's favorite subject, abortion.
Person's choice.
It's the debate really kind of orients around whether you consider a fetus a person with a right to life, liberty, and property before it's born or not. If you do, then the implication is that it is wrong to kill it, just like it would be wrong to kill an infant or an adult human being. And therefore, abortion would be an act of aggression, and stopping an abortion would be retaliation or defensive and justified. The alternative argument would be, there's a couple of alternative arguments. The alternative argument would be, one, if you don't consider the fetus a person, then that solves the problem right there. Obviously, if the fetus isn't any more a person than your toe, then it's your body, you can do whatever you want with it. The other argument would be, even if the fetus is a person, it doesn't have a right to be inside another person's body. Therefore, you have the right to remove it from your body, and then whatever happens to it, happens to it. Now, to be clear, abortion is not a fun subject. All of these positions have things about them that if you keep extrapolating, will probably disgust you, which is part of why I find it a fascinating topic. Because it is such a thorny issue if you really are honest with it. But that's just another example of an issue where even someone who's firmly committed to the non-aggression principle, you can have two people firmly committed to it on different sides of that issue.
I talked to Lynn about that abortion thing like yesterday. She said the libertarian stance on abortion is government should just stay out of it at every level of it, at every level of the clinics and everything. That's just the most global way of looking at it.
Just like the other thing, that is some people's position. The point is, in both of these things, there is legitimate disagreement. I think that's the most common position and the one that's been traditionally the libertarian position, but there are arguments against it. And my criteria that I use for this is there an argument against it that attempts to ground itself in libertarian principles, as opposed to just being like, well, I just don't agree with libertarianism on my pet issue or whatever. there are people that actually try to argue from a libertarian standpoint, a pro-life stance. And the last one I want to bring up as an area of sort of active debate, this is probably the most active of active debates in the libertarian community, is the question of anarchy, which is if it is wrong to initiate force, but it is acceptable to retaliate with force if you're defending yourself, and that we don't offer any special privilege to government agents or anything like that with regards to moral principles. Everybody's following the same moral guidelines. Let's say you have a situation where you have one government and they're doing their government-y thing. And let's say it's even like a strictly libertarian government. This government is committed to following the non-aggression principle. It only takes donations, it doesn't tax, it only prosecutes crimes where there's a victim and someone's rights are violated. Let's just imagine this hypothetical, perfect libertarian government. Now imagine someone's like, hey, you know how you donate money to that guy? I'll do the same thing, but I can do it for half the money. Now you have a situation.
Nico?
Yes, Nico. Now you have a situation. So the situation you have is that second guy that just offered to do what you're doing for cheaper hasn't aggressed against anybody. He hasn't initiated force against another person. He's offering the same defensive force service that you are. So you now have two possible outcomes. The first is that that first government says, yeah, I guess he can do that. Now you no longer have a single government. You now have competing defense services operating under an anarchic framework, essentially. So that's one possibility. There are people that argue that that is correct. They call themselves varying things, usually anarcho-capitalists or voluntarists.
Or Amazon.
Or Amazon, I guess.
That's a new one.
But the point is they argue that just like any other service, defense should be provided on the market, and it would be wrong for there to be a government monopoly on it. The counter-argument to that would be that the first government absolutely does need to use force to squash out the second government. Now, there's a few different arguments for that. Ayn Rand's argument was that she believed that an anarcho-capitalist framework would inevitably devolve into essentially like tribal or gang warfare. That the idea of having multiple defense agencies within the same geographic area all claiming to have the right to use force is going to create essentially chaos and gang warfare. That was her argument. Another argument you'll sometimes hear that I find a little more convincing is the argument that you need a single set of unified rules of contract and trade in order to have a functioning economy. The argument here would be that if you have a polycentric, which is what's sometimes called legal system, where you have multiple defense agencies, they might have different rules, they might have different ways of enforcing things, they might not even agree on what is or isn't aggression. That you create a scenario where it's basically impossible to know what is or isn't legal or what's going to happen if you do X, Y, or Z. So as a consequence, trade can't happen. Trade highly depends on some sort of consistent legal background where people know certain property rules are respected, know what the law is, etc. That's another argument against it. So the people that have that position usually refer to themselves as either like minarchists, meaning they want a minimal government, but they do want there to be a single monopolistic government, or like they're in favor of a night watchman state, that's sometimes how you hear it called. They just want a government that does nothing but enforce the nap, and that's it. Once again, I have my own opinions, not offering mine here. Well, I guess I kind of did on the second one a little bit. So yeah, that is the end of the stuff I wrote down. So hopefully that was informative, especially if you weren't familiar with the non-aggression principle.